Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guests are Bridget Sponsky, Executive Director of Brand and Sponsorship Marketing at Ally, and Mariana Dimitrova, a Managing Partner and Executive Director at Essence Mediacom. Bridget, Mariana, I am so delighted to welcome you to the show. Ally is a brand that The Internationalist has been following for a very long time. You've won a number of our awards, but I think that your work on purpose just keeps evolving. And I hope that's what we talk about today. So welcome, welcome, welcome to you both.
Glad to be here.
Well, a pleasure to have you both. Well, look, let's open by talking very generally. Now, Bridget, maybe you're the best person to answer that. I'd love the audience to know a little bit more about Ally's origins, its mission, and also why it's so important for a bank to reach new audiences and build cultural relevance. I think we both know that banks aren't always the most beloved of categories, but yet Ally always breaks the rules on that, particularly with metrics like likability and brand preference. But before I say too much, over to you and just talk about the beginnings.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Deborah. I really appreciate it. And I love to talk about the brand. So, we're really unique. Ally was born in 2009, and we were born in the middle of probably the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And it was at this time where the world didn't need another bank. It needed a better bank. It needed a bank with a better model that was customer first. And so we actually launched Ally the year that the iPhone was making its debut, which is crazy in itself when you think about it. But we took this huge bet that people would be doing everything in their life on this phone, including their banking. And so it's always been this disruptive mindset and this innovative spirit that we've embodied at Ally. And when you talk about, why is it important from a culture perspective? I mean, culture is growth, and we've always believed that. Culture is growth, diversity is growth, new audiences are growth, and we have to go where the consumers are. And in this new generation of consumers, and the way that they're consuming media is in a totally different way than consumers consumed media in 2009 when we were first launching the bank. So if we're going to stay relevant and we're going to cultivate that next generation of consumers like we have been during our lifespan, we need to learn where they are and how our brand can be most valuable to them.
Now that's interesting, and I love that you use disruptive and innovative, because a lot of people use those words, but they don't always live up to it. I just have a quick question for you, because I'm not sure, in that I was so impressed years ago when I first heard about Ally that I did become a customer. But is the majority of is the majority of your customer base younger people? Or is there now more of a, let's call it, a diversity of ages?
I would say it's a diversity of ages. Our customer base, when we started and we launched the bank, was really of the mindset of being trendsetters. You think about us as the first digital only bank launched in the year that the iPhone was making its debut. That was a turning point for culture. And as we've grown, our customer base and the way that we talk to consumers is extremely diverse.
No, and I recognize that not only with your roots in Detroit and some of the things that you've done for the city, but I recall when you did the Thanksgiving campaign, and just how extraordinarily touching that was, and again how different it was for a bank to literally grant people's wishes with money. But anyway, you talk about culture, and I think that is, you're right. It's something that's quite pivotal for you. It's usually pivotal also for brands that try very hard to be relevant. And I think that we're finding ourselves in a cultural moment, particularly with the Olympics coming up, about women's sports. So why don't we move to that? Because maybe you could tell us a little bit, as you've been growing your audiences. Why Allies involvement in sports, and how did the sponsorship with women's sports begin? And talk about that and how the whole process of that growth.
Yeah, I mean, we're fairly new in the sports sponsorship category. We actually didn't add our first sponsorship to our portfolio until 2019. So we're fairly new in the space, but women's sports was always a part of our strategy. So the NWSL, which is the National Women's Soccer League, that was actually our second sponsorship in our portfolio. And we did that in conjunction with our Charlotte Football Club sponsorship, back in 2020, 2021. So, it goes back to the conversation of our brand is really built on this diverse and inclusive belief. And with diversity as that sort of source of growth, we really expanded our sponsorship portfolio intentionally. And in 2020, 2021, women's soccer had this very intentional role. It was the fastest growing sport in the United States. The women's teams had a loyal fan base, and we really saw that opportunity to add more fans to our brand through that portfolio and through that sponsorship. But, when we talk about women's sports, there's a massive opportunity in itself to grow our audience. And while the fan base is made of men and women, what is interesting here is that when you're talking about women in women's sports, you're seeing this totally interesting trajectory of the growth of the women consumer. They're graduating at unprecedented rates from universities. They're living longer. They're actually making 90% of the household financial decisions. So women are this opportunity of growth for any business, but especially our business as a bank.
Interesting. Mariana, do you want to chime in here? Because I know that sports and that element is something that you're pretty passionate about as well.
Oh my God, 100%. And maybe just to add to what Bridget was saying, I would never forget when we had the discussion around starting to invest in women's sports. And that was a discussion with Bridget and with Andrea, Ally CMO. And Andrea kind of challenged us to figure out a way to do it. And I'm saying challenged us because the reality was that there just wasn't enough rated inventory in women's sports games and or content for us to invest. And the challenge was huge because what we wanted to do is we wanted to have 50-50 investment between men and women's sports. And again, I had two feelings at the same time. The first was elation. It was clear to me that this is going to be a pivotal moment, not just for the brand. We will be driving women's sports as an industry vertical. It's going to be a pivotal moment for my career, obviously doing something that is so momentous and will have an impact on, again, an entire industry. And again, as I was saying, I was really dreading the fact that I then had to go back to my investment team and be like, okay, so how do we actually invest this money? How do we do that? So I knew from the very beginning that we had to think differently, that our job was way beyond media, that we would have to partner with Bridget and her team, with legacy media, with emerging media, to kind of create a new marketplace. So to me, that probably, the beginning moment was probably a moment where we had to have a bit of a reality check and decide that we are going to approach this as a challenge, as a team, and we are going to drive change.
Yeah, outline just a little bit more about the challenges, because I'm guessing that aside from the fact that there's a disparity in athlete salaries for the most part between men and women, and that's not what this is about. This is sponsorship. But there also seems to be a disparity, as you start to mention, with the amount of time dedicated to airing women's sports, which is why you came up with that challenge. So now just walk us through with that 50-50 pledge. How did you actually make those changes, or how did you push networks to add
Yeah.
more women's sports? How'd you do that?
Well, it started with our sponsorship with the National Women's Soccer League and the National Women's Soccer League PA, the Players Association, and really listening to the players themselves and what they needed from a coverage perspective, from a brand investment perspective, and really listening and learning and going through that process. And it kind of goes back to our motto and the way that we approach everything, which is this idea. And, Andrea Brimmer coins this a lot, but deeds over words. And so whenever we go into something, that's the mindset of which we approach it. So that alignment with the PA was really, really important for us. But listening and learning is what really led us to this notion of 50-50 media commitment pledge, because what we were seeing was this vicious cycle happening, right? So the media companies aren't covering women's sports because the brands aren't coming to the table with investment, and the brands aren't coming to the table with investment because the media companies aren't covering women's sports. So we're just caught up in this cycle that was never, ever going to change. And it was really translating to a lot of things on the downward, which was poor time slots. It was lower value for the leagues. It was low pay for the players, like you mentioned. So, you just get caught up in this, and nobody was blinking, like nobody was changing it. And so we felt like we had that duty to blink and to change it. But the 5 years, and just to kind of level set, our 50-50 pledge was, for every dollar that we invest in men's sports media, we were going to invest that same dollar in women's sports media. And then what we said was, we got to look and see if this is possible. Can we even do this? Does the inventory even exist? And so we made that commitment over the next 5 years because we knew we couldn't do it alone. We needed to have the media companies coming to the table to cover. We needed other brands in the mix to be able to invest. We had to figure out how to change this cycle. And we took a look at our own media mix, and, it was astounding because it was a bit out of whack. When you look at our investment in men's sports and women's sports, the scale was completely unbalanced. And so we had to change that. But the hardest part about that was, we didn't really know where our dollars were going because there wasn't the opportunity to truly direct investments into women's sports. Historically, I think what women's sports has suffered from too was systemically being sold as a part of the men's sports package, or as added value in some cases, to make sure that we were making the guaranteed impressions and things like that. So inventory was so few and far between. And a lot of it was at low cost. It was off-peak time slots. So could we even do this? And that's what we had to really kind of look at and model out, is over the next 5 years, are we able to truly make that commitment and make that investment? And, 2 years in, which is absolutely astounding, is we've grown that investment in women's sports by 400%. So we are almost at our 50-50 commitment 2 years into our 5-year pledge. And that's a testament to the media companies and to the brands that are standing up and standing by us and making that commitment too.
No, congratulations, Mariana. I think you want to jump in here on a couple of things as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, Bridget said it so well, and I kind of just wanted to add a little bit about the media companies. It was interesting because they really came along with us. We weren't sure when we went to our sales teams at let's say CBS or Disney, and started talking to them about buying women's sports separately, if they will just come along. And they did. And I have to say that a lot of this was also the fact that a lot of them were fathers or mothers, and they had daughters who were in sports, and they absolutely embraced that mission. And then a part of it was just really, we all knew that sports is where culture is, and sports is growing. Sports is the only place with guaranteed ratings. And it really didn't make sense that there isn't an investment in women's sports, because we knew women's sports is growing too. So I just think that, again, we were driving that change at the right time. And we were, I think, really fortunate that we had partners across the line from a media company perspective.
You also chose a wonderful time to do it because the viewership in women's sports, just has gone through the roof with so many different players and incidences and teams and so on. And it's interesting because we covered some research by a group called Parity, that tries to do some work for athletes and women athletes. And they recently found, in surveying consumers around the world, that Interestingly, it's not what you think. A high percentage of men also are watching women's sports, particularly for some of the hallmark events in women's sports. And I think that what's interesting now, of course, is that the Olympics coming up is, and I don't know if a lot of people know this is the first 50-50 equity Olympics as well. So it's rather interesting. But let me just follow on to what you both said. You give a lot of praise, of course, to the media, but you also talk about other brands. Now, if I understand, you also developed, is it a women's sports club? And you did reach out to other brands and platforms and sports innovators. Is that correct? Is that what
That's
helped
correct.
push it? Is that what helped push this?
Yeah, it's definitely part of the puzzle that helped push it. And that was very intentional in teaming up with the Sports Innovation Lab to create a place where brands, media companies, athletes, and everybody alike can come in and actually have decision makers in the room to decide on intentional investments in women's sports and try to move the model. And that's definitely been a big piece of the pie of what's making the change. And I know Mariana talked a little bit about just the media companies that have come to the table. But, part of what we've seen from that is, not only were we able to work with CBS and move the first ever professional women's championship match to prime time, which was a feat in itself, and saw viewership skyrocket 71% that year, which was incredible. But we've also been able to work with partners like Disney and be able to direct 90% of our investment directly into women's sports through the Atlantic Coast Conference partnership that we have. So that's a model mover in itself too. So seeing a lot of this come to fruition from the Women's Sports Club, and then also being able to forge relationships with other big brands who are in the space and who are becoming in the space has proven to be important for the movement forward too.
No, again, I can't congratulate you enough. What you've done is amazing, and I love Andrea's words, yeah, deeds over words. But a lot of the things that you tackle tend to be real challenges. So let me just ask you for the fun of it, how about this challenge? Was it tougher than some of the other ones that you've done in the past, or yeah, it's always challenging to create change, but this one sounded like it was pretty tough.
It was incredibly tough. And I think it's to your point, I think it's always hard to create change. And if it was easy, everybody would do it. And I think that's what we have to go back to. But we still, struggle in terms of, investments and opportunities. We still are faced with off-peak time slots on a lot of women's sports, a lot of exclusivity issues, right? Because when we talked a little bit earlier about historically women's sports being sort of packaged with men's sports, if there is a financial institution who's locked in with the men's sports, they're kind of locked in with the women's sports in some cases. So we can't get in there, we can't invest there, and a lot of the times that's the inventory we need. I think we've seen it isn't just a one-to-one valuation. And I think that's another area that we have to be really mindful of when we're thinking of the contract process and sponsorships, because women's sports have a different valuation than men's sports do, just because of where we are in the process. So definitely challenges. And I think just there's going to be challenges to come. I don't think this is going to be a quick movement, but it is certainly a movement, and we're certainly seeing the momentum. So I think we've just got to keep at it and chipping away, and we'll start to see, hopefully at some point in the future, it just becoming sports, women's and men's equally.
No, that you well said. And I think that one of the things about marketing now that people really do talk about is that it goes beyond marketing and culture when it does become a movement, and then that movement brings it back to what it should be, just sports, which is a fascinating evolution unto itself. Let me ask you something else, because you are a bank, and there's always accountability. And goodness knows there's a lot more accountability in marketing today than there ever has been. I have no doubt that, as worthy and as passionate as people were about this sponsorship, you still had to drive business results. So, can you tell us about that? I realize some of it might be proprietary, but I'm sure people are really curious about it. And I also don't know if there is such a metric, and maybe Mariana, you know this better than I would, if there is also a metric that looks at driving cultural impact. I'm not sure, but please let us know about that.
Yeah, we actually look at metrics in both cases. So we actually watch the industry and then we look at our own metrics. And, from an industry perspective, I think one of the most telling is the fact that media coverage has grown from arguably 4% to 15%. I mean, that's a pretty big metric in a 2-year period of time. And a lot of that is due to new and emerging media platforms that are coming into play. And I think Mariana can probably talk a little bit more about that, but we're also seeing sponsorship investment growing from an industry perspective. And we're seeing records being broken all over the place when it comes to viewership. But from a brand perspective, what we're seeing since our 50/50 pledge is, some of our big brand health metrics that we look at have really grown in terms of increase double digits. And that's been incredible. And when we're seeing that type of favorability, so when we're seeing our likability grow and our preference grow and our consideration grow, that means for us, those consumers are going to be more likely to convert, and they're going to convert at a more efficient rate because we're already able to have built that trust and that preference and that likability. And then from a retention standpoint, those customers tend to be more loyal too. So we're seeing it play out for us in a brand metrics perspective, hand over fist. And I think what is really important to just kind of shed light on is that is true culture impact, because the game is tremendous. Women's sports game is tremendous, and it always has been. It's always been there. The players have always been great, and the talent has always been there, and now it's being covered and people are seeing it and the viewers are growing because of it. And, Mariana, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, you said it so well. Maybe just to, one thing that maybe I want to mention is that we knew measurement is going to be super important. So when we started working on this initiative, we knew that measurement is going to be a journey, just like the rest of the work we are doing on sports, and specifically women's sports. And we are constantly evolving, and we have to evolve because very often we are still investing in unrated inventory, and then we have to figure out how to measure the impact. But again, to Bridget's point, we know that the fans and consumers who are exposed to Ally advertising or Ally are 6 times more likely to convert. And when I say advertising, it really is women's sports advertising to the women's sports message. And that is a powerful number. Like, that is a number that it sticks with you and just makes a very compelling case. And then, we talked a bit about impact on culture and do we want to make sure that we do that as a brand? Absolutely. But again, I feel like here we are going even a layer deeper, and we are driving systemic change that in turn has huge impact on culture. And we've seen that, again, to Bridget's point, we've seen increase in a number of games that are now part of rated legacy media and or streams. We are seeing the increase in coverage. All of this is, I think, between 15 and 20%, depending on, how you, which part of it you look at. And that's huge. If in 2 years we can say there are 15% more games that are on ESPN and ABC and CBS and NBC, that is a huge, huge change. And again, look, we just started. The marketplace is just being formed. It's going to be a journey, but it is more than a solid start. It's just an exciting place to be.
Now, let me just clarify, because you said there was movement from 4% to 15%. So are you saying that meant now women's sports was only 4% of possible viewership options, and now it's moved to 15%? I just want to make sure I have the stats correct.
So I think what Bridget was referring to is that the coverage,
The coverage of
the
okay.
coverage, men and women coverage, 4% was women's sports, and then that grew to 15. And maybe another really powerful stat to mention here, if we look at investment numbers, how much are we investing in men's sports versus women's sports, we were at 2% investment in women's sports. I mean, this is just mind blowing. Of the investment in sports, only 2% goes to women's sports. A lot of work to be done, as Bridget said.
No, and one of the things that we haven't even gotten into, and I'm almost thinking it might be fun as a second series, is just how influential women athletes are in terms of people when they even support a brand or become an influencer, of just the impact they have not only on other women, but people tend to trust them more and so on. Again, another conversation, but I think this is an interesting ecosystem, in terms of looking at it from a full marketing perspective. Let me just segue to something else, because Bridget, you talked about the origins, and obviously Ally is a purpose-driven brand. You were, shall we say, born with purpose, as some people like to talk about the origins of purpose, and that you started during the financial crisis. And what I find so amazing is how your ideas of purpose keep evolving. Now, do you have advice for any other marketers who are grappling with their own purpose, and particularly ways of keeping it relevant?
Yeah, I mean, so just for context, I've been with Ally for 16 years. So I was one of the original teammates that came over here to help and rebrand the company. And so when we did that, our purpose and our values were founded on were critically important to us. And I think, the notion of our conviction being that we're all better off with an ally, and we're that relentless ally for your financial well-being, that's always been at the forefront of everything that we've done. So you've seen our brand grow and you've seen our brand evolve over time, but we've always stayed really consistent in our voice and what we believe. And I think that foundation's actually given us the ability to always come back to bringing value to the consumer. And so we have to think about, in our heads, are we working to positively affect the financial trajectory of people's lives in everything that we do? And I think that that's what leads to operating with deeds over words. And so I think my advice would be, that's what's going to make the impact. It's not the assets that come with a partnership or a sponsorship. It's the impact that you can make with that sponsorship or that partnership, and the consistency of being there. Because if we just came in and out, nothing would change. So that consistent investment is so important when you're leading with purpose.
That's very well said. And I don't think I've heard, and goodness knows, in all the conversations that I've had on purpose and all the research that we've done on its evolution, I don't think I've heard people talk about the consistency of investment, and that you've raised a very interesting point. All right, finally, we could talk, I think, for 3 days, but perhaps people wouldn't listen for 3 days. But just the last question. Is there any way you can give us a glimpse of what's next? Or I realize that could be a secret, but perhaps there's some things that you're working on now that you can share.
Yeah, there's definitely some secrets, and hopefully those secrets will be broken soon. But we just signed a big partnership with the USGA, the United States Golf Association, both on the men's and the women's side. So again, just really getting at that equity piece of it, making sure that I think another big important thing to understand is what we're doing is not a men's versus women's thing. It is a men's and a women's thing. And that equity piece is so important. And we've also signed on with the Las Vegas Aces, a WNBA team, who both USGA and the Aces are the most premier partners. They're already breaking records. It's been absolutely a fantastic year for us and our first year partnership with both of those entities. And, you'll see us to continually invest intentionally, I think, staying true to our focus on media equity, pushing this traditional sponsorship model into opportunities to really make long-term change. That's the direction that we're going. So I think you'll see some really cool things from us to come.
Wonderful. Mariana, any final words?
No secrets here. I think that probably the most important initiative I'm working on right now and kind of pushing the envelope together with Bridget and for, the marketplace in general is establishing a solid women's sports marketplace. So Group M announced a few months ago that we are launching a women's sports marketplace. That also was something that wasn't in existence. And I have to say that without Andrea and Bridget and their team, we most likely would not have launched the women marketplace when we launched it. It would have taken us a bit more time. So the push we got from Ally was very timely. So we are really working on making sure that there are the opportunities that will lead brands to invest more in women's sports, so we could drive systemic change, so we can grow ratings and we can create more inventory that is attractive from an investment perspective, and ultimately will lead to brand growth.
Well, nothing's been better said, and deeds over words, and you're both much to be admired. It's an honor to have you talking about this, and congratulations to you both, and may you continue doing such great work.
Thank you, Deborah. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
A pleasure. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.